Hi, this is Frank Duff, the Chief Innovation Officer from Tidal Cyber. We've got a wonderful discussion today with Justin Ibarra from Elastic to talk about their recent contribution to the Tidal Product Registry. As some of you may know, we've been doing this series called We've Got This Covered, an attack coverage introspection, which is really trying to focus around understanding the goods and the bads of attack and attack coverage from people that have been living this and breathing this, working with customers to understand how to communicate with it, as well as using it in their day-to-day lives as practitioners. And so with that, Justin, why don't you give us a little bit of introduction to you as well as to what Elastic does?
Yeah, thanks. So first off, thanks for having me. It's exciting to see what Tidal's doing and to be able to talk about our efforts. So my name's Justin Ibarra, as mentioned. I'm the team lead for the threat research and detection engineering team at Elastic Security. Essentially, we focus on researching threats, specifically targeting endpoints, cloud workload assets, and essentially any technology that we deem is in scope. We turn that research into tangible detections and prevention capabilities, such as largely being based on telemetry-based rules. I did come to Elastic via the InGame acquisition in 2019, and prior to that, I spent about 13 years in security, mostly operational security roles, 10 of which were with military and DoD, and then the rest was in an MSSP. So talking a bit about Elastic, essentially, Elastic is a comprehensive platform built to help users search, observe, and protect their data and environments. More specific to Elastic Security, which is one of the primary solutions built into the product. It's a modern security operations solution that unifies prevention, detection, and response, basically to help stop attacks. It delivers layered prevention, deep contextualized visibility into security eventing across hosts, network, cloud, and user domains, along with a rich set of response capabilities. It's driven to be scalable and easy to use. You can run it SaaS or on-premise, and it supports easy integration with other tools. It had its roots in EDR and SIEM, but it's grown to encompass cloud security, SOAR, XDR, and many of the other popular buzzword acronyms that we like to throw out there. Essentially, what makes it so powerful, though, and unique is the fact that it's able to encompass all of this capability natively, built on top of other core Elastic components. A big part of that is a rich ecosystem of integrations, which is built on top of ECS, and it includes a stack-based detection engine, which focuses on detection, and we also have the endpoint sensor-based equal engine, which focuses a bit more on prevention. There's many other security features built in. Again, we take a very layered approach to how we are enabling users, and we also give them significant control, allowing them to detect, prevent, and respond in ways that they feel they're comfortable.
Yeah, and I mean, Elastic does do a ton, right? As you just kind of alluded to with that answer and trying to expose it, right? And I think, at least for me, as somebody that's been in the industry as long as I have, right? Oftentimes I think of Elastic, I think of like more of the SIEM type of capabilities, right? And being able to join data. And I think that one of the really unique things about it is that you've got this other component that kind of has some of those roots in InGame, as you mentioned, and in fact yourself did. So I think that is a very interesting dynamic between the two. How do those two really come together and relate before we go too far down this attack rabbit hole, just to make sure that people have that kind of perspective of how these two worlds came together?
Yeah, for sure. So InGame has been in the business for a long time before the acquisition. And shortly leading up to the acquisition, the major focus was EDR, endpoint detection, prevention, response. And it was about the same time. Well, actually, we often joke, right? Most people in security were using the ELK stack long before Elastic acknowledged that it was essentially being used as a security product. And, I was one of those practitioners. So it just felt like, such an organic marriage when it came together. And yeah, ironically, one of the most difficult components, that most security vendors face, but specifically InGame, was the search capability, right? And that's where Elastic thrived. And so they were just getting into starting to build the SIEM capability. And so it was again, that perfect marriage of the SIEM, the search, and the endpoint, and of course, all the censoring and endpoint and data collection technology underneath. that it just made so much sense. And it was a very smooth transition, and it just made a lot of sense.
Very cool. Very cool. So I think that going back in time, right? So I go back a long ways with both the InGame and the Elastic crew, even pre-merger. And so I could definitely go into a lot about my history going to the InGame office back in the day and talking about attack before it was even attack. But where do your and Elastic's kind of roots start from for being able to use attack and the genesis of all that?
I think we all agree that security coverage, it's a really complex thing, right? And this is something that vendors, researchers, end users, everyone's contending with this, right? Ultimately, coverage, it's largely contextual and relative, based on your environments, priorities, and many other factors. But categorizing threats, right? That's always been an important prerequisite step to determining many things, such as your own respective threat landscape. Not too dissimilar from having a very detailed inventory of your assets. And so I think the industry early on recognized that attack was doing a great job classifying specific behaviors and activities. And this encouraged many to move on from things like the cyber kill chain, which was highly leveraged at the time, because it felt like attack went at least one layer, if not many more deeper. So you were able to provide, a much better understanding, correlation of events. And so, and finally, actually, I think it helped to establish a common lexicon, right? Making it easier for users, researchers, vendors, everyone to kind of communicate with the common language, right? And so, like many vendors at the time, we saw the need to evolve how we communicated and classified these threats. And so we started baking this into the InGame product from very early on, at the beginning of 2017. And the way we did that, all rule-based alerts were labeled with at least a tactic and a technique if it was applicable. And additionally, we had this concept of enrichments, where events within the timelines of alerts were additionally labeled. So even those much noisier attack techniques, right, we were able to leverage those in a coherent manner that didn't flood users with too much data. And of course, it's also been within the Elastic Security app since its inception. And so pivoting to how we use MITRE ATT&CK today, I think we can classify this into essentially what we're doing in the product and what we're doing in our research and development efforts, which drive the product. And so within the product, again, it provides one of many ways for users to sort and pivot on their rule of coverage. Attack tends to be one of the favorites for users, again, because of its commonality and all that. And so additionally, it's leveraged to show correlations between alerts, events, behaviors, whether it's across cases or just individual alerts. Again, not too dissimilar from InGame. It's built into the app from inception, like I talked about. And so rule-based alerts are enriched with the attack data. And this shows up in many places visually, things such as timelines, session view, analyzer, which are our process trees, dashboards, and of course, a whole array of other visualizations. And so it's really baked in kind of everywhere, right? We try to leverage it everywhere we can. And from a research and development perspective, we use it a lot to scope and prioritize where we're going to focus our efforts. At the same time, it helps us to measure coverage in progress. And of course, like everyone, it allows us to quickly build simulations, which allow us to test and emulate these behaviors. But yeah, those are a couple of ways we're using it.
Yeah, and that shows the full gambit of it, right? And I love that you touched on not only the how you integrate it into your product, but that it actually still motivates like what is getting developed next, right? The prioritization component, which is a big thing that Tidal obviously tries to focus on, giving people the understanding of, okay, this is what you should prioritize next. So it's great that you touched on that. Really, a threat-informed defense approach to even product development, because a lot of people think about organizationally, but it's good to hear that you actually have that as well. And going to your attack mappings, I think one of the things that I wanted to draw attention to was you guys do actually post rule sets to GitHub. And those rule sets all, to your point, have those attack mappings to them. Can you go into a little bit about what that rule set is and how that relates to the core product?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have two public repos, detection rules and protections artifacts. I hit a little earlier on the fact that we had a stack-based detection engine and then an endpoint-based equal engine. So detection rules reflects the stack-based detection engine. Again, we open sourced that early on, shortly after inception of the engine itself. And from that time forward, we not only host the rules there, we do all of our development there. We collaborate with each other, we discuss, we tune, we collaborate with the community very openly, right? And that's always been our intent. And so you can see everything in there, even rules in development, deprecated rules, tunings of rules, and they're taken from there and directly staged to Kibana and pushed into the product. And like you mentioned, every time we push to main, we have a refresh on our navigator layer file. So you're able to always have, a snapshot into what our present existing coverage is. Protections artifacts, that feature came around, the endpoint engine came around a little bit later. And so it's a little bit lagging in terms of why the repo came out later. Essentially, it's not that we were holding on to it, it just came out a little later. And, we also, so we host our endpoint rules there, in addition to that, our Yara signatures. And so same thing, it's been a tremendous opportunity to be able to collaborate with the community, especially on protections, right? Most of those tend to be more prevention based. And so we've gotten a lot of exciting user interaction based on those.
Yeah, and I mean, personally, I mean, coming from my roots at MITRE, I'm obviously very biased, but I always appreciate when security industry is trying to be transparent about things, right? And say that this is what we do and kind of work at it as a community versus trying to silo this off and cordon it off, right? A lot of people will treat, especially things like protections, as like special sauce, right? And to a certain degree, some of them are, and I'm sure you guys have some of the capabilities in the background that are more special sauce. But at the same time, trying to be as open as you can about what you have, I think is really an important aspect to kind of that we share at Tidal, to kind of, it takes the village kind of approach, right? And trying to be just more transparent about it so people can actually know what they have. So I really love that. And in fact, that's kind of what is at the core, the Tidal community edition, right? So at the community edition, you can see all the information that's within ATT&CK, but we try to enrich it with the what to do about it, right? And then what part of that is what we call the product registry. And of course, we're talking with you because you guys have recently provided your data to showcase within that registry. So you can, instead of necessarily just using the JSON file that's in your GitHub repo, which we fully support, we also have those layers available in our product registry and our community edition. So if you want to go and see what, for instance, Elastic does against a specific threat, right, you can bring that up and see what threat goes to techniques go to capabilities, and you guys are providing those capabilities. But from your experience, like, what is it about Tidal Cyber? What is it that you kind of share as kind of like the important aspect of why you guys wanted to participate?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so at the core, similar to how you just mentioned, our mission is to be an open security company. And that doesn't just mean open source code, right? It's going well beyond that, right? Like I mentioned earlier, building, collaborating, and hosting our security artifacts in the open as well, right? Starting with those two repos, again, which we opened as early as we could, collaborating with the community, right? We go beyond just those repos. We're constantly communicating in our public Slack. We're constantly acknowledging and working with community users on open issues, either building new detections into the product itself or helping them build custom ones for their own environments. And so ultimately, it's huge for us to be able to communicate and collaborate with the industry. I think we all know that we've kind of gotten past the days of security through obscurity. And so, we're kind of hoping to carry the torch and move vendors in the industry forward in that. Because ultimately it fosters a better environment and understanding of threats for both us and the community. And so, yeah, I mean, in the end, Tidal's goal of making coverage publicly accessible and intuitive actually just perfectly aligns with our own vision. So,
that's great to hear. And I would like to share the sentiment that the industry's moved away from security through obscurity, but unfortunately, there's still plenty of examples of those for a variety of reasons that do want to keep things more close held. One of the things that I wanted to touch on is attack coverage, right? You mentioned it a couple times in a few different contexts. and right, you guys have protections, you guys have detections, you have multiple detections for some techniques and things like that. How do you or how do your users think of attack coverage? Like what's the guidance that you can kind of like, what comes to mind when I bring up attack coverage to you?
Yeah, so we like to be very honest about coverage, right? Including the fact that it can be very complex. And additionally, the fact that, attack is just one way to represent it. And attack itself has its own limitations, right? Sometimes we'll interact with users who tend to be very checklist driven, where they perceive one-to-one coverages of attack as like their interpretation of a successful product, right? And so for those, we try to help educate them, that it should be leveraged as a tool, not an absolute grading rubric. But at the same time, we like to focus more on the positives of attack, right? And highlight the values of it, such as some of the things we talked about earlier, right? How we can leverage it to correlate related behaviors, understand relationships between different attacks, understand potential progressions of attacks, and then finally organizing and prioritizing threats based on an understanding of those threats. And so, I mentioned earlier all the places where attack data within the product visually. So additionally, we have this concept of building block rules, where essentially you can tag an event as an alert, but it's not necessarily processed as an alert. And so what this allows is you can kind of get these attack labelings, this enrichment for free in all those places visually that we talked about. And so that creates like a much more visually rich and informative experience. And of course, users can take advantage of our robust visualizations, build their own dashboards specific to their environments or workflows. And then, of course, one of the things we also like to share is one of the things I touched on earlier is from an R&D perspective, right? We ourselves have heavily leveraged it, for scoping, planning, but at the same time, we're not constrained by it. Especially because, as I mentioned earlier, we focus on endpoint cloud, but our research scope tends to be very broad. And so it goes beyond potentially existing coverage for tech. And so, those are some of the things we talk about. Of course, everyone kind of has their own perception of attack and what coverage is. And so we're just continuing to explore ways to, determine what successful coverage is. It's actually something we've heavily considered recently, and how we can leverage attack, but again, not fall victim to being constrained by it or thinking through the lens of just attack.
Yeah, and I loved a couple points that you brought up there, and one of which you brought up earlier in a slightly different context. But one of the challenges comes with a lot of users try to treat it like the bingo card, as some will say, or right, the checklist, that try to have something on everything and consider that good. But one of the things that I really like about what you were saying is, and you said it a couple different times, is that it's not about alerting on every technique, right? In some cases, the word you used was enrichment is satisfactory, right? And I think that's one of those interesting concepts, right? Like so from a end user perspective, right? Oftentimes you hear, okay, you shouldn't treat attack as a checklist. You shouldn't strive for every coverage of every technique. But on the other hand, you're actually in some way saying, what, you could do every technique, but it's about doing it smartly. It's about trying to make it so it's not just another alert, and instead trying to be, okay, well, let's pull the data together and just use it to kind of give context, right? And so it's really interesting when I talk to people about coverage, and having lived and breathed attack for as long as I have, I've had a lot of different conversations, and I've hated the matrix as a summary, and I've loved the matrix as a summary, and that's a pendulum that swings back and forth for this very reason. But I really like the line that you're drawing to be like, what, you can, it's about understanding the depth, understand the context, understand the situation and what you're really trying to do there, and piece it all together. So I really like those aspects that you're bringing up there. So one of the things that beyond just the enrichment that you guys are doing, is there anything else that you find particularly noteworthy in how InGame approaches attack, that you think would be worth considering?
In how Elastic approaches attack, yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry, Elastic.
No, it's okay. And you kind of hit on some of the bigger points, I think, just then. We tend to be very cognizant and sensitive to alert fatigue, right? One of the cons of being so comprehensive, right, is potentially if someone's using us for all of that coverage, it could translate into a lot of alerts. And so, one of the things we often discuss is like linear alert scaling is it's not feasible. It's not better for users, right? An infinite number of rules, which extrapolates into an even bigger number of alerts, is not a measure of success, or it shouldn't be. And so we try to think of ways, like intuitive ways to go beyond that, right? Things like grouping, correlating. And of course, we're doing this on all kinds of things, attack data being one of the main ones, right? People want to see, like, what are all these classified by a certain tactic or technique? But we also pivot on other data, right? The user, the host, prevalence of a process, prevalence of other indicators, IPs, and all that. And so we're certainly trying to, we have a lot of former practitioners on the team, and we've all kind of been in the seat, right, when we've been inundated with alerts. And even with the best playbooking, at that point it kind of goes out the window because it's just too much. It's almost insurmountable. And so we've been putting a lot of efforts into thinking about that. Visually is, I think, one of the ways, right? We tend to be very efficient, like humans, visually. And so how we convey that either graphically or again, stacking and pivoting, I think that's very important. But at the same time, we're very data driven. And so, there's also ways to pivot based on that. And I think ultimately, one of the common things with our approach is like, how can we enable users to decide for themselves what's the best way to handle it themselves?
So one last question before we kind of close things out, but to piggyback on what you just said there, the thing that comes to my mind is attack is a very oftentimes sophisticated concept, right? And I think that it's done a good job about making it so we can talk about cybersecurity easier, but it's still not super easy. So wondering about like the how you guys approach making it so that the typical user, the person that's not steeped in this day to day, can actually talk about how they're addressing threats. Do you have anything that you could particularly call out as something that would be a tip for people to consider as they're trying to get people to be more threat informed and kind of lower that barrier of entry? Like, what have you seen work, for instance?
Yeah, that is definitely a tough one. And one of the ways that we try to handle that, right, is with context. And I know that's tough too, because that's what attack is context with a lot of data and a lot of cross-referencing. And so just to pile on more context, you can argue isn't necessarily the most efficient. But one of the things we do is we accompany rules with guides, right? We call it an investigation guide. And it's not meant to be comprehensive. It's meant to be concise. And it's definitely not supposed to be, a regurgitation of what attack is already saying in the label data. So it's essentially a way to apply it one level further, essentially, with obviously in generic context, because we don't know the respective user. It's very contextual. Users have to kind of, insert that themselves. But so we try to take, a consistent generic approach that just layers one level on and says, between your environment and attack, at least within the context of this data, right, within the stack, these are some things you can do, right? Look at this other data set, pivot to this integration, run this OS query, whatever it is to help build it contextually, and again, give you as much context to be able to triage and make a decision on that respective alert.
Yeah, I love that about being able to bring more information, but again, do it in the smart way to try to, so you don't flood the analyst. But you know what, if they want to peek in and look under the covers a little bit, let's give them the ability to look under and see what things actually are and advance it. So really appreciate that extra perspective that you're bringing there. So anything else that you wanted to touch on here?
No, that's all I had. Again, we're very excited to see, the fact that open security is starting to catch on more, and that, organizations like Tidal are, becoming not just commonplace, but but celebrated, because again, there was a time where it was taboo to kind of talk about security, and it's something that excites us. And hopefully this is just another avenue to foster these types of conversations and collaboration.
Absolutely. Well, Justin, this has been absolutely great. I definitely appreciate Elastic's support and Tidal's vision of pushing through that transparency and being a part of the community edition of our platform, and really making it so practitioners can understand what you can do and how they could get what you have. Right. I think those are very important for decision making. So thanks for being on this. Thanks for everybody listening on the call today. And feel free to jump over to tidalcyber.com to learn more about what we're doing, and go into the platform to see exactly what Elastic is doing with their attack mappings these days. We look forward to continuing to update those as you guys continue to update that repo. Yeah, so thanks very much, Justin, and thank you everyone for listening.